So we're thinking about cycles. That's liturgical theme for January. And I don't know about you, but the idea of cycles, especially now at the turn of the year, makes me think of beginnings and endings. And my hunch is that it is a pretty common idea for the theme of cycles to inspire thoughts of beginnings and endings. But just because it is common does not mean that it is not strange. Because it occurs to me that it is strange that a cycle makes me think of beginnings and endings. A cycle is a repeatable pattern, so we could just as well be talking about process and rhythm. Generally speaking, there is more process and rhythm to a cycle than there are beginnings and endings, of which in any cycle there's one point, and all the rest is process and rhythm. So we could just as well be talking about process and rhythm, and perhaps we ought to. And in the end, we are, which is how I get off the hook. I'll get to that later in the cycle, or sermon. So our lives are organized by cycles, and most prominently and obviously the cycles that we apply to time. The cycles of seconds and a minute and then another minute. Minutes in an hour and then another hour. Hours in a day, days in a week, weeks in a year, years in a decade and then another decade, and then another decade, and decades in a century, and on and on. These chronological cycles within cycles are helpful in organizing our schedules, right? But more germane to our apprehension this morning, they are important to our reflections of and on ourselves and our perspective on life and living. These cycles are not merely arbitrary markings of repeatable patterns onto the linear rampage of time. They're more than that. They are reflections of our own biology and of our primitive, which is to say, fundamental understandings of the workings of the cosmos. They are reflections of our biology and our primary understanding of our relationship to the earth and the earth's relationship to all that moves beyond the earth. They are the intersection of the cosmic and the human. So a day, as a concept and an experience, is a reflection of the intersection of the cosmic and the human. A minute, as a concept and experience, is a reflection of the intersection of the cosmic and the human. And in that reflection of the cosmic human threshold, in those cycles, there is an invitation, perhaps even an obligation to reflect on that interface. So that's kind of a complicated, preacherly, and spectacular way to say something pretty simple. And the news here isn't that we do this. We reflect on this interface compulsively. We are inundated, especially right now, with lists of the best moments, music, pictures, and stories of the year. We make resolutions or attend goals, workshops. And we do this consciously or unconsciously at the turn of many other time cycles that I've mentioned as well. And so this isn't news. What is news, perhaps, is how important these activities are. They are nothing less than religious activities. And they may seem trivial, all these lists, but in fact, they mark time, they honor experience, they shape and reinforce identity, and when it comes to resolutions and goals, they are effectively prayers for the future. And I don't know that it gets much more religious than that. And of course, in some ways this is navel-gazing, but navel-gazing becomes important during those times when you really need to know who you are. When those times come where courage is no longer optional. So I said resolutions were like prayers for the future, but what about when there is no future? What happens when the world ends? And it is ending. Plankton, the basis for the entire planetary food chain, are dying as ocean temperatures rise. Meanwhile, peak oil has come and gone, and oil is used to make everything, and used to make everything that makes anything that makes something. And in a way, neither of those matter. I mean, maybe the plankton problem corrects itself, or maybe we find some new material to deliver, store, and build without the use of petroleum. But solved or not, the end is still nigh. You see, all apocalypse is personal. We may all get one together, but we certainly all get one on our own. At least one. For there's the obvious death. But there are also apocalypses of insufferable tragedy and trauma that we have to live into. And so what then of the cycle? How does this navel-gazing help us in end times? So earlier I defined a cycle as a repeatable pattern. And while that is true, it is not complete, and it actually points to a paradox. And I'm thinking here of the life cycle, and looked at from a distant perspective, say from the perspective of biology or history. A perspective capable of applying a wide lens, a lens that does not, due to its breadth, give a great deal of significance to individuals. It appears as though the life cycle is indeed repeatable. Individuals are born, grow up, grow old, and perish. Hopefully. Individuals do this with such frequency, predictability, and regularity that the life cycle can be understood as repeatable. We all repeat this cycle. We are in this cycle. However, it is our privilege to repeat it only once. And this is true even if your understanding of life includes reincarnation. For though your soul, however you define that, may reintegrate with another form that will pass through its own life cycle, your duration with this body of cells, with this body of people, with this personal and cultural and institutional history, with this environment, happens only once. It is a cycle. It comes to an end, but it does not repeat. And so, we have stumbled into our paradox, for we seem to be a part of a cycle that repeats, but the repetition does not include the material arrangement of the previous pattern. The life cycle is like a musical score, a simple one. Birth, growth, decay, and perish. It's a simple score, but it is played with infinite variety of musical instruments, and none twice. And we are those instruments. And so from one point of view, I could read this as being kind of depressing and revealing a dynamic wherein we are both robotic and insignificant. Okay, but from another point of view of the same process, I can see that each life cycle, each of us, is living out something that is profoundly, cosmically fundamental, arching back through time and space, through evolution itself, all the way back to the Big Bang, and maybe even before that. For while this perspective, where we cherish the rhythm and its instruments, rivets us to and integrates our minds with this fundamental cosmic cycle of life and being itself, it also highlights the utterly unique manifestation of that pattern that is us. That is you. You amazing instrument, unique amongst the innumerable, riffing on a simple score in a way only you do. This is astounding. I mean, inherent dignity? Are you kidding? Most definitely. Look into your lover's eyes, your neighbor's eyes, your child's eyes, the eyes of the person next to you now, or on the other side of your coffee cup later. And you will see the repeating rhythm of life itself, the very chant of God, and you see the utterly unique instrument through which that chant manifests. I mean, enjoy your coffee. And as I consider the life cycle as cycles within cycles, rhythms within repeatable rhythms, within repeatable rhythms, within repeatable rhythms, minutes within hours, hours within days, days within years, years within decades, decades within centuries, centuries within eons, and on, reminds me of the massive scale and wheels within wheels in the Hindu concept of time. And so it reminds me of them, but I'm really just barely familiar with these notions. But as I understand it, Hindu time accounts for outrageously long durations of cycles, always cycles, huge cycles, billions, trillions of Earth years, cycles on a Carl Sagan level. And these cycles themselves are actually incarnations or aspects or actions of some of the more panoramic members of the Hindu pantheon. So for instance, I've read that some trillion year or so cycle is equated with the life and death of one deity who is in turn born of and annihilated by the breath. Right? So it's the incarnation of the breathing of a more encompassing God. One cycle of breath, billions of years. A God that is responsible for, or even the incarnation of, billions of years of matter and life is but a single breath of another being who breathes at the center And so life cycles are on a scale, and Hindu mythology and chronology goes to great lengths to get this point across. And even now, as you are breathing, because of your breath, beings are coming into existence and perishing. Breath ends worlds, and breath gives life. We are living cycles within which living cycles move. Ourselves moving within ever grander cycles to no end in both directions. And everything's connected. This blows my mind. I'm also not sure how it's relevant. I mean, how does this make a difference in our daily living? And more importantly, in the face of apocalypse? Will this perspective help? And with some things from that I say from this pulpit, I have great confidence in their broad applicability. And while this perspective on life and death inspired by cycles within cycles may well have broad relevance, I hesitate to invest much confidence in it because death is so highly personal. It's one of the most private experiences we will ever have. And since we are unique instruments, I cannot say how your playing of those last few notes will sound or whether this perspective is helpful or not. So I can only tell you what it does for me. But I'm strange. Of course, we observed earlier that just because something is strange does not mean it is uncommon. For me, to understand that I am a conscious part of a cycle within cycles that are as ancient as being itself, while simultaneously being an utterly unique part of that infinite rhythm, connects me to the ground of all being, and also encourages my freedom from the infinite. This gives me peace, even as I let pieces of me go, even as parts of me die. For while we are the manifestation of cycles within cycles, there are also biological and psychological cycles that take place within us, cycles of life process through our bodies and our minds and our lives. And so even as I say farewell to very dear and beloved lives I've lived within this one life that I am living, even as I move through these deaths, I take from this perspective some modicum of peace, whose roots I find in awe. So I pray this peace prevails through all my cycles and through all my deaths and births in this life and at the very end. We are invited into this perspective now as we reflect on the turn of the year, the end of a cycle, and now as we exhale, now as we inhale, and now, amen within amen.